$10. That is what this war is costing your family every single day. Not in some abstract national debt kind of way. $10 a day, straight out of your household, according to Congressman Thomas Massey, who did the math on the floor of Congress. That is just the military bill. That does not include the 80 cents more you are paying per gallon every time you fill up your tank, which Time magazine calculated is draining Americans of $300 million in extra gas costs every single day. It does not include the 30% spike in fertilizer prices that is about to hit your grocery bill this summer. It does not include the mortgage rate that was 5.98% 2 days before the bombs dropped and is now 6.22% and climbing. It does not include the 50,000 flights that have been canceled, the million people who were stranded, the airlines that are doubling their fuel surcharges, or the fact that jet fuel has surged 60% in 3 weeks. And it definitely does not include the fact that 20% of the entire world's oil supply has been choked off through a 21-mile waterway that most Americans cannot find on a map, and nobody, not the White House, not the Pentagon, not our allies, has a plan to reopen it. 20 days ago, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. In the first 6 days, we burned through $11.3 billion. The Pentagon is now spending $1 billion a day on this war. The Penn-Wharton budget model projects the total economic damage to the United States could reach $210 billion. And all of that money is being borrowed, added to a national debt that is already $38 trillion, with interest payments that already eat $950 billion a year. We are borrowing money to fire $4 million interceptor missiles at $20,000 Iranian drones. That is a cost ratio of 200 to 1. And we are doing it while 92,000 Americans lost their jobs last month, while inflation is running at 2.8% and accelerating, while the Fed just told us they have no idea how bad this is going to get, and while 75% of the American public said they did not even support these strikes. But here is what nobody is telling you. Gas prices are not even the beginning. They are the surface. Underneath that, there are at least 10 economic shockwaves heading straight for your wallet right now, and most of them have nothing to do with what you pay at the pump. I am talking about supply chains breaking in ways that have never happened before in modern history. Industries you have never thought about that are quietly collapsing behind the scenes and are about to take your cost of living with them. Critical resources that most Americans do not even know exist being cut off from the global market right now as we speak. And one scenario, the one I saved for last, that has the potential to permanently change America's position in the global economy in ways that would affect your children and your grandchildren. 10 things. I have the data, I have the sources, and I am going to walk you through every single one. Let's go. All right, guys. I want to kick this off with something that is going to blindside the vast majority of Americans because almost nobody in the mainstream media is covering this angle, and yet it might be the single most devastating long-term consequence of this entire conflict for your household budget. And that is the global fertilizer crisis that is unfolding right now in real time as a direct result of the Strait of Hormuz being shut down. Now, I know when most people hear the word fertilizer, they immediately tune out because they think that has nothing to do with them. They think fertilizer is a farming thing. It's an agriculture thing. It's something that only matters if you're growing corn in Iowa. But let me tell you right now, fertilizer is the invisible foundation of your entire food supply, and what is happening to it right now should terrify you. Here's what most people have no idea about. The Persian Gulf isn't just the world's gas station. It is the world's fertilizer factory. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, approximately 1/3 of all global seaborne fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about 43% of the world's seaborne urea exports, which is the most widely used solid nitrogen fertilizer on the planet, the stuff that makes corn and wheat and rice actually grow at the yields needed to feed 8 billion people. And it gets worse. The Gulf region produces 44% of the world's seaborne sulfur, which is a byproduct of oil and gas refining that is absolutely essential for producing phosphate fertilizers. Without sulfur, you cannot make phosphoric acid. Without phosphoric acid, you cannot turn phosphate rock into something plants can absorb. So you are not just losing the fertilizer itself, you are losing the raw ingredients that the rest of the world needs to make their own fertilizer. And right now, as we speak, at least 21 ships carrying nominally 1 million metric tons of fertilizer are physically stranded in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go because no captain in their right mind is going to navigate a vessel through a waterway where Iranian drones and missiles have already struck 16 commercial ships since this thing kicked off on February 28th. Major producers like Qatar Fertilizer Company and Saudi Arabia's SABIC Agri-Nutrients have already declared force majeure on their export contracts, which is a legal term that basically means sorry, we literally cannot deliver what we promised you because of circumstances beyond our control. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. Unlike oil, there is no strategic fertilizer reserve. The G7 countries maintain strategic petroleum reserves, but nobody thought to stockpile fertilizer. Saudi Arabia built a pipeline to bypass the Strait of Hormuz for oil exports, but there is no pipeline for ammonia. There is no pipeline for urea. There is no infrastructure workaround whatsoever. The Carnegie Endowment made this point crystal clear. A ship captain brave enough to dash through the strait under threat of drone strikes would carry oil, not fertilizer, because oil is worth more per ton. So fertilizer is literally at the back of the line even in a best-case scenario. And the timing of this could not possibly be worse. Because right now, as in right now this week, farmers across the entire northern hemisphere are entering the spring planting window. This is the most critical period in the agricultural calendar. If farmers cannot get their fertilizer inputs in the next few weeks, they either plant without adequate nitrogen and phosphorus, which means dramatically lower yields come harvest, or they shift to less fertilizer-intensive crops, which means less corn and more soybeans, which means the entire grain supply chain gets reshuffled in ways that will ripple through food prices for the next 12 to 18 months. Urea prices have already surged 30% to $550 a ton at the port of New Orleans, with some global spot prices hitting $680 a metric ton. And Morningstar's analysis suggests nitrogen fertilizer prices could straight up double from current levels if this drags on. We saw a preview of this exact scenario in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine and fertilizer prices tripled in some markets. The result was food inflation that crushed families around the world. But here is the critical difference that nobody is flagging. In 2022, Russian fertilizer could at least be rerouted through alternative shipping lanes. In 2026, there are no alternative routes. The fertilizer is physically trapped. There is no workaround. And the American Farm Bureau Federation has already written directly to President Trump, warning that these disruptions could push already record-high input costs even higher, at a time when farm margins are razor-thin and many farmers are already underwater. So when you walk into your grocery store 3 or 4 months from now and you see the price of bread and cereal and chicken and beef and everything else has jumped another 15 to 25%, now you know why. It is not corporate greed. It is not the grocery store trying to rip you off. It is the fact that the invisible supply chain that feeds you runs through a 21-mile-wide choke point that is currently a war zone, and nobody had a backup plan. Number 9. The helium crisis. You've never heard of, and how a noble gas is about to sabotage everything from your MRI to your smartphone. Now I guarantee you that when you clicked on this video, you did not expect me to talk about helium. And I get it. When most people think of helium, they think of birthday balloons and that squeaky voice you make when you inhale it at a party. But what I am about to tell you is something that maybe 1 in 1,000 Americans actually understands, and it is going to blow your mind when you realize how deeply this one element is woven into the technology and the healthcare systems that you depend on every single day of your life. So here is the thing that almost nobody knows. Qatar produces approximately 30% of the entire world's helium supply, and I don't mean they produce a lot of it. I mean they produce nearly a third of everything the planet uses. Their helium operations are concentrated at Ras Laffan, which is the same massive industrial complex that handles their liquefied natural gas exports, the same facility that was hit by Iranian missile strikes in the first week of this war. And when I say hit, I mean Qatar Energy has publicly confirmed that the attacks reduced the country's LNG export capacity by 17%, and they have said it could take up to 5 years to fully repair the damage. 5 years, guys. That is not a typo. Now helium comes out of the ground mixed with natural gas. You extract it during the LNG production process. So when you shut down or damage the LNG infrastructure at Ras Laffan, you are not just cutting off natural gas exports, you are simultaneously cutting off helium production. And according to CNBC's reporting this week, closing the Strait of Hormuz could take approximately 27% of the world's helium supply offline. And UBS Global Wealth Management flagged in a report just days ago that helium is a key input for semiconductors, industrial manufacturing, and medical imaging, and that any lengthy disruption will impact not just energy prices but food prices and industrial production across the board. So let me break down why this matters to you specifically, because I know you are sitting there thinking, okay, helium, so what? Number 1, medical MRI machines. Every single MRI scanner in every hospital and imaging center in this country uses liquid helium to cool its superconducting magnets down to minus 452 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to absolute zero. Without helium, those magnets cannot function. Period. There is no substitute. There is no alternative coolant that works. If helium supply gets tight enough, hospitals are going to have to start rationing MRI access, which means longer wait times for diagnostic imaging, which means delayed diagnoses, which means people with cancers and neurological conditions and internal injuries waiting weeks or months longer to find out what is wrong with them. Number 2, semiconductor manufacturing. Every advanced chip that goes into your iPhone, your laptop, your car's computer system, the servers that run the AI models everyone is so excited about, all of it requires helium during the fabrication process. Helium is used as a carrier gas, as a cooling agent, and in leak detection during chip manufacturing. The Semiconductor Industry Association warned back in 2023 that a helium supply disruption would cause shocks to the global semiconductor manufacturing industry. And Bank of America's analysts confirmed this week that helium demand is concentrated in high-value mission-critical applications, where supply security is prioritized over price, which is a fancy way of saying that when helium gets scarce, the semiconductor industry will outbid everyone else for whatever is left, and the industries at the bottom of the priority list, like party balloons and welding and certain types of laboratory research, are going to get little to no allocation at all. And number 3, and this is the one that connects it back to your wallet. When the cost of helium goes up, the cost of manufacturing the technology you buy goes up. Phil Kornbluth, a helium industry consultant with over 40 years of experience, told CNBC this week that everybody is going to feel this to some degree during the transition period, and that even buyers at the front of the priority line will see significant price hikes because the industrial gas companies are not going to play favorites. They will do their best to keep everybody supplied, but there is a price for that. And here is what makes the helium situation uniquely dangerous compared to oil. You can drill for more oil. You can release strategic reserves. You can ramp up shale production. But helium is a finite byproduct of radioactive decay deep underground. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot synthesize it in a factory. Once it is released into the atmosphere, it is gone. It floats up and escapes into space because it is so light that Earth's gravity cannot hold it. So every cubic foot of helium that is not being produced right now at Ras Laffan is a cubic foot that the world has to scramble to replace from an already tight global market, where shortages have been recurring every few years for the past 2 decades. Linde and Air Products, the 2 biggest industrial gas suppliers in the world, have both seen their stock prices surge 14 to 15% this year alone because the market is already pricing in what a prolonged helium shortage means. And if you are sitting there thinking, well, this is interesting, but it does not really affect me, I need you to think again. Because the next time you need an MRI and the wait list is 6 weeks instead of 1, or the next time your phone costs $200 more than the last model, or the next time a hospital visit costs even more than the already insane prices we are used to paying in this country, a meaningful chunk of that increase is going to trace back to a noble gas that most Americans could not even identify on the periodic table being cut off from global markets because of a war that most people still think is just about oil and gas prices. This is the kind of second and third order consequence that nobody sees coming until it is already here. And it is already here. Here is something that I am willing to bet less than 1% of the people watching this video have ever thought about, and it is the thing that might be doing more damage to your cost of living right now than the actual missiles being fired in the Persian Gulf. I am talking about maritime war risk insurance. And I know your eyes just glazed over because that sounds like the most boring topic on the planet. But stay with me here because this is the hidden mechanism that is silently strangling global trade, and it is about to hit your wallet from a direction you never expected. So let me explain how this works, because once you understand it, you will see why everything from the shirt on your back to the food in your fridge is about to get significantly more expensive, even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens tomorrow. Every single commercial ship that sails the ocean carries insurance. Without it, no port will let you dock, no bank will finance your cargo, no charter will hire your vessel. Insurance is not optional in global shipping. It is the invisible infrastructure that makes world trade possible. And there are specific insurance policies called war risk policies that cover damage from things like missiles, mines, drones, torpedoes, and seizure by a foreign government. Before this conflict, war risk premiums for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz were running at about 0.125% of the vessel's insured value per transit. That is already not cheap when you are talking about a supertanker worth $150 million, but it was manageable. It was a cost of doing business. Now, here is what happened the moment this war kicked off. Within 48 hours of the first strikes on February 28th, war risk premiums spiked to over 1% of vessel value. The Financial Times reported that in some cases premiums increased 12-fold. And then the really devastating thing happened. Major marine insurance providers started canceling coverage entirely. Guard, Skuld, North Standard, the London P&I Club, the American Club, all of these are among the biggest names in marine insurance on the planet, and they issued formal cancellation notices for war risk cover in the Persian Gulf. That means it does not matter how much money you are willing to pay. You literally cannot get insurance for a ship going through the Strait of Hormuz right now from most of the world's major insurers. And without insurance, ships do not sail, period. This is why tanker traffic through the strait dropped to effectively zero within the first week, despite the waterway never being physically blocked by a chain or a wall. It became uninsurable. The strait is physically open but commercially closed, and the cost consequences are staggering. The benchmark freight rate for very large crude carriers, the supertankers that carry 2 million barrels of oil from the Middle East to Asia, hit an all-time record of $423,736 per day, according to LSEG data. That is a 94% increase from the previous week. And it is not just oil tankers. Hapag-Lloyd, one of the largest container shipping companies on Earth, implemented a war risk surcharge of up to $3,500 per container as of March 2nd. And that is on top of regular freight charges that were already elevated because the Red Sea has been disrupted by Houthi attacks since late 2023. A logistics CEO in Cyprus told CNBC that his company tried to hire a dry bulk vessel to carry rice to West Africa around the Cape of Good Hope, which should have nothing to do with the Persian Gulf, and they lost the ship because someone else paid 50% more than normal to carry coal from Indonesia to India. Why? Because the ship owner was afraid of not being able to get cargo from the Gulf, so they took the premium alternative. That is how interconnected this is. A war in the Persian Gulf is driving up the cost of shipping rice to Africa and coal to India on routes that are thousands of miles away from the conflict zone. And Gartner, the advisory firm, has research showing that supply chains experience a 40% surge in cost to serve after major disruptions. 40%. And every single dollar of that increased shipping cost gets baked into the price of whatever is inside that container. Your electronics, your clothes, your auto parts, your furniture, your everything. President Trump even announced that he ordered the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation to provide political risk insurance to shipping lines, but nobody knows if that can actually be implemented or how it would work. So right now, the global shipping industry is operating in a state of emergency driven not by a physical blockade but by an insurance vacuum. And that vacuum is adding billions of dollars in costs to global trade every single week that gets passed directly through to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices on virtually everything you purchase. And the craziest part is that even after this war ends, insurance premiums in the Persian Gulf are not going to snap back to pre-war levels. Insurers have long memories. They are going to reprice Gulf transit risk for years after this, which means the shipping cost inflation you are experiencing right now has a structural component that is going to persist long after the last missile is fired. Flying anywhere is about to become a luxury most Americans cannot afford, and the aviation industry is in full-scale crisis mode right now. If you have a vacation planned this spring or summer, if you are supposed to fly anywhere for work, if you have a wedding to attend, or a family event, or literally any reason to get on an airplane in the next few months, I need you to pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you, because the aviation industry is in the middle of what might be its worst crisis since COVID, and almost nobody is talking about how bad it is about to get for the average traveler. Let me start with the jet fuel situation, because this is the engine that drives everything in aviation. Pun absolutely intended. Before the strikes on Iran on February 28th, a gallon of jet fuel in the United States cost about $2.11 according to the Argus U.S. Jet Fuel Index. As of mid-March, that price has surged to $3.78 a gallon according to Platts. That is a 60% increase in less than 3 weeks. And globally, it is even worse. Air New Zealand reported that jet fuel prices jumped from between $85 to $90 per barrel before the war to between $150 and $200 per barrel, before the war to between $150 and $200 per barrel, which is so volatile and so extreme that the airline literally suspended its entire 2026 financial outlook because they could not even predict what their costs were going to be from one week to the next. Now, let me put this in perspective for you with a number that will make your jaw drop. United Airlines spent $11.4 billion on fuel last year at an average price of $2.44 a gallon. If fuel stays anywhere near current levels for the rest of this year, United alone could be looking at an additional $3 to $4 billion in fuel costs. And unlike in previous decades, almost no major U.S. airline hedges their fuel anymore. United CEO Scott Kirby literally said at a Harvard event last week that no one hedges anymore, and that even if you do, hedging the crack spread, which is the difference between crude oil and refined products like jet fuel, is really hard. That means every single cent of these fuel price increases is hitting airline balance sheets in real time with zero buffer. And where does that cost go? Straight to your ticket price. Cathay Pacific announced they are doubling their fuel surcharge on every ticket starting March 18th, going from $72.90 to $149.20. Air New Zealand raised fares on domestic and international routes. SAS announced it is canceling at least 1,000 flights in April. Qantas raised international fares. And Deutsche Bank reported that the average price of last-minute domestic flights in the U.S. increased between 0.4% and 13.6% week over week in just the first days after the war started, with Spirit Airlines seeing advance purchase fares spike 124% in a single week. But it is not just fuel prices that are destroying the economics of flying right now. There is a massive airspace problem that nobody outside the industry fully grasps. When the war started, airspace was closed over Iran, Iraq, Israel, Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. That is an enormous chunk of the sky that connects Europe, Africa, and the West to Asia. Over 50,000 flights have been canceled since February 28th, according to aviation analytics firm Cirium. More than 1 million people around the world were stranded. Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Etihad, which jointly handle about 1/3 of passenger traffic between Europe and Asia, and more than half of all passengers from Europe to Australia and New Zealand, either suspended or drastically reduced operations. And when all those passengers get displaced onto alternative routes, you get a demand surge that overwhelms remaining capacity, which pushes fares even higher on routes that are nowhere near the Middle East. And this is coming on top of the airspace closures that already existed from the Russia-Ukraine war, which had already eliminated a huge swath of Russian airspace from use by Western carriers. So pilots are now rerouting to avoid both Russia and the entire Middle East, which means longer flights, more fuel burn, fewer available routes, and higher costs everywhere. Deutsche Bank analysts warned that if this continues, airlines around the world could be forced to ground thousands of aircraft, and that some of the industry's weakest carriers could halt operations entirely. And here is the kicker that brings this home for you personally. Even if you are not flying internationally, even if you only fly domestically within the United States, you are still going to feel this, because jet fuel is jet fuel. It does not matter if the plane is going to London or to Tampa. The fuel cost increase hits every flight equally. Jefferies airline analyst Sheila Kahayoglu said she expects the most acute financial impact to come in the next 30 to 90 days because airlines had already sold tickets at prices that assumed much lower fuel costs, and they cannot retroactively raise fares on tickets already purchased. So airlines are going to be hemorrhaging money on every flight they already sold, and they are going to make up for it by jacking prices on every future ticket. Your spring break trip, your summer vacation, your holiday flights at the end of the year, all of it is going to be meaningfully more expensive than it would have been 3 weeks ago. And if this conflict drags on and fuel stays elevated, some budget carriers might not survive, which reduces competition, which means the remaining airlines can charge even more. This is the aviation death spiral, and we are watching it start in real time. Your dream of buying a home just got crushed again, and here is exactly how a war 7,000 miles away killed your mortgage rate. I want you to think back to February 26, 2026. That was a Wednesday. And on that day, for the first time since September 2022, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate in the United States fell below 6%. It hit 5.98% according to Freddie Mac. And if you were paying attention to the housing market, you know what a massive deal that was. 6% had been this psychological barrier, this line in the sand that economists said once we crossed below it, buyers who had been sitting on the sidelines for 2 or 3 years would finally start coming back. Pending home sales were already ticking up. There was optimism. Zillow's senior economist said buying power was up $30,000 compared to a year earlier. The spring home buying season, which is historically the busiest time of the year for real estate, was looking like it might actually deliver some relief after years of brutal unaffordability. And then 2 days later, on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. And within a week, that 5.98% mortgage rate was gone. By March 5th, it was back at 6.00. By March 12th, it was 6.11. And as of this week, March 19th, it hit 6.22%, the highest level since early December and climbing. Now I need you to understand why this happened, because it is not obvious and most people do not connect a war in the Middle East to their mortgage payment. But the connection is direct and it is powerful. Mortgage rates in the United States are tied to the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond. When investors get nervous about inflation, they sell Treasury bonds, which drives the yield up, which drives mortgage rates up. And what does a war in the world's most important oil-producing region do? It sends oil prices through the roof, which makes investors terrified that inflation is about to come roaring back, which makes them dump treasuries, which pushes yields up, which pushes your mortgage rate up. That is the transmission mechanism. Oil price shock turns into inflation. Fear turns into bond market sell-off, turns into higher mortgage rates, and it happened at warp speed. Crude oil went from $71.23 a barrel on March 2nd to $115.53 on March 9th, the first time it passed 100 since 2022, and mortgage rates moved in lockstep. HousingWire's lead analyst Logan Mohtashami put it bluntly when he said that no current economic data really matters as long as this Iranian conflict is not resolved. And he is right, because normally when you see a weak jobs report like the 92,000 jobs lost in February, that would put downward pressure on rates. Weak economy means the Fed might cut, which means rates could come down, but the Iran oil shock completely overrides that signal. You have this bizarre situation where the economy is weakening, which would normally help you get a lower mortgage rate, but inflation fears from the oil shock are pushing rates higher at the same time. It is the worst possible combination for somebody trying to buy a house, and here is where this gets really cruel. The housing market in America was already in crisis before a single missile was launched. We had a massive shortage of homes. Housing starts for single-family homes totaled 943,000 units in 2025, down from over 1 million the year before. Builders were already not building enough because of high material costs, labor shortages from immigration crackdowns, Trump's import tariffs driving up the price of lumber and steel, and a shortage of available building lots. And now you are layering on a spike in diesel costs, which means construction equipment costs more to operate, a spike in petrochemical costs, which means roofing shingles and PVC piping and insulation and paint all cost more, and a spike in mortgage rates, which means fewer buyers can qualify, which means builders have even less incentive to start new projects. Lisa Sturtevant, the chief economist at Bright MLS, said the outlook for the spring home buying season has become cloudier than it was just a month ago. And Hannah Jones at Realtor.com warned that the conflict combined with inflation and tariff policies threatens to keep mortgage rates and construction costs elevated and further tighten the market. The median existing home price in America has risen for 31 straight months. A Reuters survey predicts prices will rise another 1.8% this year and 2.5% in 2027. So prices are going up, rates are going up, supply is going down, and construction is slowing. And every single one of those trends just got worse because of a war that most Americans think has nothing to do with their housing situation. But it has everything to do with it. And the people who are getting destroyed the most are first-time homebuyers, young families trying to get their foot in the door, people who were counting on rates coming down this year to finally be able to afford a place of their own. They were this close. They could almost taste it when rates dipped below 6%. And now the rug has been pulled out from under them by a geopolitical crisis that they had no say in and no control over. That is the reality of the housing market right now, and it is only going to get worse the longer this conflict continues. All right, now I need to shift gears here and talk about something that is going to affect tens of millions of Americans in a way that goes far beyond what they pay at the gas station or the grocery store. And that is what this war is doing to the job market and to your ability to earn a living in this country. Because here is the thing that most people are not putting together right now. The American labor market was already in serious trouble before a single bomb was dropped on Iran. And I mean serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that shows up in a headline, but the kind that economists describe as a slow bleed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the U.S. economy shed 92,000 jobs in February 2026. Let me say that again because I do not think people have fully absorbed what that number means. We did not add jobs, we lost 92,000 of them. And that was not some one-off fluke. It was the sixth decline since January 2025 and the second largest. On top of that, the BLS revised the December and January numbers downward by a combined 69,000 jobs, which means the labor market was even weaker in those months than we originally thought. The unemployment rate ticked up to 4.4%, and here is what makes this genuinely frightening in the context of the Iran war. JP Morgan's economist Joseph Lupton wrote in a note right after the strikes began that a pillar of their 2026 outlook was what they called the fading of caution, meaning businesses were finally starting to move past the paralysis caused by tariffs and high interest rates and were beginning to hire and invest again. That recovery, that fragile little green shoot of optimism, is now at risk of being crushed. Because what happens when businesses see oil surge 40%, shipping costs explode, insurance premiums skyrocket, and input costs rise across the board? They freeze, they stop hiring, they start looking at where they can cut. And the first thing that always gets cut is people. U.S. employers announced more than 1.2 million job cuts in 2025, according to Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, the highest total outside a formal recession or the start of the pandemic since they began tracking layoffs in 1989. And now you are layering an energy shock and a war on top of that. Major corporations including Morgan Stanley, Block, UPS, and Amazon have all announced job cuts recently, and the labor market is stuck in what economists are calling a low-hire, low-fire state, which sounds kind of stable when you say it quickly, but what it actually means is that companies are not firing people in massive waves yet, but they are absolutely not hiring either. So if you lose your job right now, you are entering a market where almost nobody is bringing on new people. The number of job openings according to the JOLTS report sits at 6.9 million, unchanged, which sounds decent until you realize that a year and a half ago it was over 9 million. The labor market is contracting, and the war just accelerated that contraction. And here is the part that connects all of this together in a way that should genuinely scare you. Consumer spending accounts for roughly 70% of U.S. GDP. When people lose their jobs or feel insecure about their employment, they stop spending. When they stop spending, businesses see revenue drop. When revenue drops, those businesses cut more jobs. And you get the vicious feedback loop that turns a slow labor market into a recession. Fed Chair Jerome Powell himself said this week, and I am paraphrasing here, that nobody knows how big the economic effects of this war will be. He said they could be bigger, they could be smaller, they could be much bigger. That is the chair of the Federal Reserve telling you that the most powerful economic institution in the country has no idea what is coming. And if the Fed does not know, I can promise you that the average American who thinks this war is just going to mean a few extra bucks at the pump is woefully unprepared for what might be heading their way. Your job, your hours, your bonus, your raise, your ability to switch careers or negotiate better pay, all of it is now tied to the outcome of a military conflict in the Persian Gulf. And if you are not thinking about that right now, you need to start. The Federal Reserve is trapped in the worst policy nightmare since the 1970s. And there is literally no good option left. I need you to understand that what is happening right now is putting the Fed in a position that is so difficult, so contradictory, and so unprecedented in modern terms that even the people running it are basically admitting they do not know what to do. Let me set the scene for you. Just 2 days ago, on March 18th, the Federal Open Market Committee voted 11-1 to keep the federal funds rate at 3.5 to 3.75%. That was expected. But what was not expected was the level of uncertainty and borderline alarm that came through in Powell's press conference afterward. He acknowledged that near-term inflation expectations have risen, likely driven by the substantial rise in oil prices. He said it is too soon to know the scope and duration of the effects on the economy, and he used a phrase that every economist in the country noticed. He said, "You worry that this is the kind of thing that can cause trouble for inflation expectations." That is central banker speak for we might be losing control of the narrative. And here is why this matters to every single person watching this video. The Fed has what is called a dual mandate. They are supposed to keep inflation low and keep employment high. Those are the two jobs. And normally those two goals do not conflict with each other. When the economy slows down and jobs are at risk, the Fed cuts interest rates to stimulate borrowing and spending. When inflation gets too hot, the Fed raises rates to cool things down. Simple enough, but an oil shock creates a nightmare scenario where both problems show up at the same time. Inflation goes up because energy costs are surging through every layer of the economy, and the job market deteriorates because those same costs are crushing businesses and consumers. This has a name. Economists call it stagflation. And Oxford Economics chief U.S. economist Michael Pierce said this week that the Iran war is producing exactly that, a stagflationary impulse. Now Powell pushed back on that label, saying he would reserve the term for a much more serious set of circumstances. But here is the thing. The direction of travel is undeniable. Before this war, markets were pricing in 2 rate cuts in 2026, possibly even 3. That optimism has been destroyed. EY Parthenon chief economist Gregory Dacko has revised his forecast to show only 1 cut this year, likely in December, and he said it is entirely plausible the Fed will not deliver any rate cuts at all. The Street reported that some analysts are even beginning to discuss the possibility of rate hikes in 2026, not cuts, rate hikes. Let that sink in. And Wells Fargo described the mix of a weakening jobs picture and higher inflation as, and this is a direct quote, the FOMC's worst nightmare. The Fed updated its own projections this week and raised its inflation forecast for 2026 to 2.7% on both headline and core PCE, up from previous estimates. They still project inflation falling back toward target in 2027, but that is based on the assumption that the war's effects are temporary, and nobody actually knows if that assumption is correct. If oil stays above $100 for months, if the Strait stays closed into the summer, if the conflict escalates further, that assumption falls apart and the Fed will have no choice but to keep rates elevated for much longer, or potentially raise them into a weakening economy. And what happens when rates stay high or go higher? Mortgages get more expensive. Car loans get more expensive. Credit card debt gets more expensive. Business loans get more expensive. Student loans get more expensive. Small businesses that are already barely surviving on razor-thin margins cannot refinance their debt, and they close, and consumer spending, which is 70% of the economy, contracts further. This is the trap. If they cut to save jobs, inflation spirals. If they hold or raise to fight inflation, the economy craters. There is no winning move. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen told a shipping conference this week that the war puts the Fed even more on hold and makes them more reluctant to cut rates than they were before. And Fed Governor Stephen Miron, who was the lone dissenter favoring a rate cut, is clearly worried that inaction could cause its own kind of damage. The Fed is paralyzed, and the longer this war drags on, the deeper the paralysis gets. And every day that it persists, the economic damage accumulates in ways that will take years to unwind even after the shooting stops. This is not hypothetical. This is happening right now, this week, in real time. Number 3. The stock market and your retirement are sitting on a powder keg, and most people have no idea how exposed they are right now. Okay, guys, if you have a 401k, an IRA, a pension, a brokerage account, or any money whatsoever in the stock market, I need your full undivided attention for the next few minutes, because what I am about to walk you through is something that has the potential to affect the retirement security of tens of millions of Americans, and most of them have no idea it is happening. Let me take you back to March 2nd, the first trading day after the strikes on Iran began. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped over 400 points. The S&P 500 fell 0.7%. And that was just day one, before the real economic consequences had even started to materialize. Since then, markets have been whipsawing violently on every headline. Oil spikes, stocks drop, Trump says the war might end soon, stocks rally, Iran hits more ships, stocks drop again. Brent crude briefly topped $119 a barrel before pulling back. The VIX, which is the market's fear gauge, has been elevated well above normal levels. And here is what most retail investors, regular people with 401k accounts, do not understand about what is actually happening beneath the surface of these market moves. There is a massive structural vulnerability in the financial system right now that has nothing to do with the stock market's day-to-day price action, and it is the private credit market. Now, I know that sounds like some obscure Wall Street term, but this is critical, so stay with me. Over the past decade, a shadow banking system has grown from basically nothing to over $3 trillion. Companies like Blackstone, Apollo, Blue Owl, KKR, Carlyle, and Ares have been lending money to privately owned companies, real estate developers, and infrastructure projects. And where did they get the money to lend? From pension funds, from insurance companies, and from everyday retirement investors through 401k allocations. The returns looked amazing during the era of cheap money and zero interest rates. So billions poured in, but here is the problem. These are not liquid investments. You cannot just sell them and get your money back like you can with a stock or a bond ETF. These loans are locked up in long-term contracts. And when investors get nervous and want out, as they are trying to do right now, the funds cannot sell fast enough to give everyone their money. Blackstone, the world's biggest alternative asset manager, had a record amount of withdrawals from its $82 billion credit fund. Redemption requests were so high that Blackstone had to use its own money and its own employees' personal money just to cover the gap. Blue Owl completely stopped redemptions on one of its retail funds, which means investors were literally told, sorry, you cannot have your money back right now. BlackRock started limiting withdrawals as well, and the stock prices of these firms are reflecting the stress. Blue Owl, KKR, Blackstone, Ares, Apollo, Carlyle, all of them have seen their shares decline significantly. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon issued a warning on an earnings call saying, and I am paraphrasing, "When you see one cockroach, there are probably more." That is the CEO of the largest bank in America, telling you that the problems in private credit are probably worse than what is visible on the surface. And here is where the Iran war makes all of this exponentially more dangerous. When oil prices spike and the economy slows, the companies that borrowed money from these private credit funds see their revenues drop and their costs rise. Some of them cannot make their loan payments. Defaults start to tick up. And when defaults rise in an illiquid market where investors are already trying to pull money out, you get a cascading deleveraging event. The loans lose value, the funds take losses. The losses spook more investors into requesting redemptions. The funds have to sell assets at fire sale prices to meet those redemptions, which drives prices down further, which triggers more panic. This is the same basic dynamic that turned a small cluster of subprime mortgage defaults in 2008 into a global financial crisis. And I am not saying we are in 2008. But what I am saying is that the structural conditions, high leverage, illiquid assets, interconnected institutions, and a sudden economic shock from an external event, those conditions rhyme. Schwab's analysis published this month warned that the disruption to energy and commodity supplies is likely to have an increasingly negative impact on economic and financial conditions the longer it goes on, and that even if military activity ends soon, the impacts to growth, inflation, and commodity prices could linger. And for somebody who is 58 years old with $200,000 in their 401k planning to retire in a few years, a 30% market drawdown combined with a credit market freeze is not a theoretical exercise. It is the difference between retiring with dignity and working until you physically cannot. That is what is at stake right now. And the cruel irony is that the people who are most exposed, the ones with the biggest percentage of their net worth in retirement accounts and the least amount of time to recover from a major loss, are the ones who are paying the least attention, because they assume their 401k is just humming along in the background on autopilot. It is not. It is sitting on top of a financial system that is showing visible cracks, and the war in Iran is applying more pressure to those cracks every single day. You are paying for this war right now, and you will be paying for it for the rest of your life. The hidden tax that no one voted for, and no one can opt out of. All right, guys, lean in for this one. Because what I am about to tell you is the single most infuriating economic reality of this entire conflict, and it is something that no politician on either side of the aisle wants to explain to you in plain language. You are paying for this war, right now, today. Not in some theoretical future sense, not in some abstract taxpayer kind of way. You are paying for it every time you fill up your car, every time you buy groceries, every time you look at the interest rate on your credit card statement, and you will continue paying for it for decades after the last bomb falls. And the mechanism by which you are being charged is so clever, so indirect, and so buried in the machinery of government finance that the vast majority of Americans will never see the bill. So let me show it to you. The Pentagon briefed Congress behind closed doors, and the attendees who came out confirmed that the first 6 days of Operation Epic Fury cost American taxpayers approximately $11.3 billion. Let me break that down for you. About $5.6 billion was spent on munitions alone in the first 48 hours. Another $5.6 billion went to interceptor missiles to defend against Iran's retaliatory strikes. $2.3 billion for air operations. $310 million just to replace 3 F-15 fighter jets that were hit by friendly fire. And $630 million was already spent before a single bomb dropped just to reposition more than a dozen naval vessels and over 100 aircraft to the region, starting in late December. And those were just the opening days. The ongoing burn rate has been estimated by defense analysts and congressional sources at between $800 million and $2 billion per day, depending on the intensity of operations. Senator Elizabeth Warren went into a classified briefing and came out and told reporters, and I am paraphrasing, that while there is no money for the 15 million Americans who lost their health care, there is apparently $1 billion a day to spend on bombing Iran. And the Penn-Wharton budget model, which is one of the most respected fiscal analysis tools in Washington, run out of the University of Pennsylvania, has projected that the direct military cost of this war will likely land around $65 billion, with total economic damage to the United States potentially reaching $210 billion when you factor in the ripple effects on energy markets, trade, and consumer spending. And here is the part that should make your blood boil. None of this money exists. The United States government does not have a war savings account. The federal government is already running a deficit of roughly $2 trillion a year. Every single dollar being spent on Operation Epic Fury is being borrowed. The Treasury is issuing new bonds to pay for it. That debt gets added to the national balance sheet, which is already approaching $38 trillion, and that debt accrues interest. At current rates, a $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil raises the Pentagon's annual operating costs by an estimated $1.3 billion, because the Department of Defense is one of the largest fuel consumers on the planet. So the war is not only expensive to fight, it is making everything the military does more expensive to maintain, even outside of combat operations. And the interest payments on the war debt will be paid by American taxpayers for 10, 20, 30 years, depending on the maturity of the bonds that are being issued right now to fund it. The Congressional Budget Office already projects that net interest payments on the federal debt will exceed $950 billion this year. If the war adds another $50 to $65 billion in borrowing, the annual interest cost on that alone at current rates is somewhere between $2 and $3 billion a year in perpetuity. Over 20 years, that is $40 to $60 billion in interest alone, paid for by you on money that was borrowed to fund a war that 75% of Americans did not even support, according to the Reuters Ipsos poll conducted the weekend the strikes began. Only 1 in 4 Americans said they support the strikes. Only 1 in 4 Republicans said Trump has been too willing to use military force. And yet the money is being spent at a pace that dwarfs what Congress allocated to the National Cancer Institute, which got $7.4 billion for the entire year. The first week of this war cost more than what we spend in a year trying to cure cancer. And the way you are really paying for it, the hidden mechanism, is through inflation. When the government borrows hundreds of billions of dollars at speed, it floods the Treasury market with new bond issuances. When bond supply surges, yields have to rise to attract buyers. The 30-year Treasury yield has already climbed close to 4.9%, the highest in a month. Gang Hu, managing partner at Winshore Capital Partners, connected the dots directly when he said that long-end rates are a fiscal story and a government credibility story, and that they reflect expectations that Trump needs to spend money to fund the war and subsidize consumers for higher oil prices. And when Treasury yields go up, your mortgage rate goes up, your car loan rate goes up, your credit card rate goes up, your student loan rate goes up, not because the Fed changed anything, but because the government is competing with you for borrowed money, and the government always wins that competition. So you are paying for this war through higher prices at the pump, higher prices at the store, higher interest rates on every form of debt you carry, and a dollar that buys less every single month because the government is printing and borrowing at a pace that devalues the currency you work for. That is the hidden war tax. There is no line item on your paycheck. There is no surcharge on your tax return. But it is there, silently draining your purchasing power, and it will continue doing so for the rest of your working life. Every dollar spent on Tomahawk missiles and carrier group fuel is a dollar that is not being spent on infrastructure, on healthcare, on education, on social security, on any of the things that actually make life better for the people footing the bill. And the cruelest irony of all is that the people who are being squeezed the hardest by this invisible tax are the same people who were already barely making it before this war started. Okay, guys. I saved this for last because this is the one that keeps me up at night. This is the one that goes beyond gas prices and grocery bills and mortgage rates and even the stock market. This is the one that, if it plays out the way the data is suggesting it could, will fundamentally alter the economic position of the United States in the world and reduce the standard of living for every American for decades to come. And I want to be very careful here because I am not a doom and gloom fear-mongering creator. I try to give you real data and let you draw your own conclusions. But I would not be doing my job if I did not tell you about this. And it starts with a concept that most Americans have never heard of, but that underpins literally everything about our economic prosperity. It is called the dollar's reserve currency status. Here is what that means in plain English. Since the 1970s, the vast majority of international trade, especially oil, has been priced and settled in US dollars. This is the petrodollar system. Countries around the world need dollars to buy oil. So they hold massive dollar reserves. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and that demand for dollars is what allows the United States to borrow cheaply, run enormous deficits, and maintain a standard of living that is significantly higher than what our domestic production alone would support. It is the single greatest economic advantage any country has ever enjoyed in human history, and it is under threat right now in a way that is more concrete and more accelerated than at any point in the last 50 years. Before this war, the de-dollarization trend was already underway, but it was moving slowly. China and Russia now settle around 90% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan, not dollars. China's CIPS payment system, which is their alternative to the SWIFT network that the West uses to move money globally, now connects 4,800 banks across 185 countries. The MBN Bridge platform, which enables instant central bank digital currency payments between nations, processed over $55 billion in transactions by late 2025. The BRICS bloc, which now includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Indonesia alongside the original members, covers nearly 45% of the global population and 28% of global GDP, and they are actively building financial infrastructure that operates completely outside of the dollar system. The new development bank has set a target of conducting 30% of its lending in local currencies by this year. Central banks globally added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024 for the third consecutive year. China alone added 225 metric tons in 2023, its biggest single-year purchase in nearly 50 years. The dollar's share of global reserves has already dropped from 72% in 2001 to around 56% today. That is a massive erosion over 2 decades, and the pace is accelerating. And now layer this war on top of all of that. When the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent issued a temporary 30-day waiver allowing Indian refiners to purchase Russian oil to keep global energy flowing, that was not just a practical decision. It was a signal to every country on Earth that when push comes to shove, the U.S. will crack its own sanctions framework to keep the system from collapsing. And when other countries see that, they do not think, oh great, the system is flexible. They think the system is unreliable and we need to build alternatives faster. The war is costing between $1 and $2 billion a day. The 30-year Treasury yield has climbed to nearly 4.9%. Matt Egan, a portfolio manager at Loomis Sales, which oversees more than $430 billion in assets, said plainly that the war is adding to the deficit and that wars are inflationary. Ron Paul wrote in a March 11th op-ed that wars like Iran inflate costs, add to the $38 trillion in debt, pressure the Federal Reserve to monetize, and could erode the dollar's reserve status in a way that sparks a crisis worse than the Great Depression. Now, is that the most likely scenario? Probably not in the immediate term. The dollar is not going to lose its reserve status overnight. The British pound took about 30 years to lose its position to the dollar, and that was after 2 world wars. But the trend is undeniable, and the war is accelerating it. Every $1 billion we borrow to fund combat operations is $1 billion that gets added to a debt load that makes foreign holders of treasuries increasingly nervous. China has reduced its treasury holdings to $682 billion, the lowest since 2008 and far below its 2013 peak of $1.32 trillion. Brazil cut its holdings by 27% in a single year. India dropped 20%. When the largest foreign holders of your debt start selling, that is not noise. That is a signal. And the signal is that the world is slowly, methodically, systematically building a financial system that does not need the United States at the center of it. The BRICS unit, which is proposed to be backed 40% by gold and 60% by member currencies, is not a fantasy anymore. The infrastructure to support it is operational. The Bridge platform works. The CPIF system works. The Shanghai Gold Exchange is expanding. And every time the U.S. weaponizes the dollar through sanctions or destabilizes global energy markets through military action, it provides the exact justification that BRICS nations need to accelerate the transition. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario that no mainstream outlet will spell out for you this clearly. It is not that the dollar crashes tomorrow. It is that the dollar slowly, over the next 10 to 20 years, loses enough of its privileged position that the United States can no longer borrow cheaply, can no longer run massive deficits without consequence, can no longer import far more than it exports without paying the price. And when that happens, estimates suggest American living standards could decline by 10 to 20% over a decade as the enormous subsidy that reserve currency status provides gets eroded. Everything gets more expensive. The government's ability to finance itself gets harder. Interest rates stay permanently elevated, and the average American family, which is already stretched to the breaking point, gets squeezed from every direction with no relief in sight. And the war in Iran, this war that most Americans think is just about oil and missiles and some faraway country they cannot find on a map, could be the historical inflection point that future economists look back on and say that is when the cracks became irreversible. That is when the rest of the world decided it had enough and started building the exits. I am not telling you this to scare you. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what is at stake. Not just this month, not just this year, but for the next generation of Americans who are going to inherit whatever financial system we leave behind. And right now, the trajectory is not good. So stay informed, stay sharp, Make smart decisions with your money. Build that emergency fund. Diversify your assets. Pay attention to what is happening in the world because the world is paying very close attention to what America is doing and it is making decisions accordingly. And those decisions are going to affect your life, whether you are paying attention or not. All right, guys, that is everything. 10 points. 10 ways this war is coming for your wallet, your job, your home, your retirement, and your future. If you got value out of this, do me a huge favor and smash that like button because it helps the algorithm push this out to the people who need to see it. Share it with someone who has been complaining about gas prices but does not understand why. Subscribe if you have not already because I am going to be covering every major update on this conflict as it develops. Drop me a comment and tell me which one of these 10 points hit you the hardest. I read every single one, and I will see you in the next video. Stay sharp.